Thank you for joining us. You are a part of an elite group who recognizes that Black women's health should be at the forefront of the national conversation. We are mothers, daughters, activists, entrepreneurs, entertainers, corporate warriors, and more, who help boost the economy and often drive the national conversation. For 38 years, the Black Women's Health Imperative has strived to amplify our voices, help enact policy that protects us, research our issues, create programs that enhance our lives, and produce events like this one to ensure we keep the conversation going about the issues that matter to us most. So, let's get started with our program.
Let's get started. Good afternoon. I'm Leslie Foster, and I'm really honored to be your moderator this afternoon. And on behalf of the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series of conversations focused on exploring the role that clinical trial researchers, principal investigators, healthcare professionals, and others can play in effectively addressing disparities in the rare disease space. According to a recent FDA study on clinical trial participation, close to 80% of the people taking part in these kinds of trials are white. Black Americans, who make up 13% of the population, are just 7% of the participants in clinical trials. So you can see there the disparities. And the National Institutes of Health estimates that between 25 million and 30 million Americans have some kind of rare disease. And because of the relative obscurity, the accurate diagnosis of these diseases sometimes takes more than common disorders. And how long does it take? Well, there are estimates that it can take anywhere from 5 years and an average of 7 doctors to get an accurate diagnosis. And so imagine what it is like to endure that kind of journey. The disparities in clinical trial participation, the inequities, the delays in diagnosis experienced by rare disease patients of color are compounded in many ways by significant underrepresentation of minority, racial, and ethnic populations in both the medical and the clinical research profession. So there's really a significant need for a level set for educational resources and programs aimed at improving the diversity among scientists and researchers in the biomedical and clinical research space. So today, the topic for our very first virtual conversation in this series is Know Your Options, Careers in Clinical Trial Research. And you are going to get to hear from some fantastic experts today. Our panel is going to feature diverse subject matter experts and seasoned clinical professionals with the credibility and really the expertise to motivate medical students and early career medical professionals of color to pursue careers in clinical research. There's no doubt today that you will be inspired. Through this seminar series, the RDDC hopes to realize increased minority populations in positions such as clinical trial investigators and coordinators who would thereby facilitate minority recruitment in clinical trials and in research, which we've just heard is so very important. So why don't we get started? Let me introduce to you our panelists today. Dr. Sana Sayed. She is clinical lead and neurologist at Sanofi US, and she's the vice president of the American Muslim Health Professionals. Dr. Felton Anderson is a cardiologist with the Anderson Medical Group and Cardiology. Dr. Finney Hunter Richardson is the assistant professor and director of research, the Department of Community and Family Medicine at Howard University College of Medicine. Dr. Isaac Rodriguez Chavez is the senior vice president for scientific and clinical affairs for ICON PLC. And rounding out our dynamic group today is another doctor, Dr. Sybil Anderson, who is the Director of Diversity and Research Programs for the National Medical Fellowships Incorporated. Thank you all for carving out some space for greater exploration this afternoon. And I should also tell everyone, this conversation is really about you and for you. So we want you to be part of it. If you're thinking of some questions that you've just been really excited to ask, go ahead and put those in the comment section. And when we get to the end of this panel, we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So let's begin. And I'd love to sort of build a solid foundation for the framework of our conversation today. And so, Dr. Syed, if we could have you just take a few minutes to really explain to us, what is clinical trial research? Talk to us about the phases, who can participate, and why diversity is so important in both the participants of the research and those who are working in the clinical research space.
All right. Thank you, Leslie, for your question and the introduction. I'm very excited to be a part of this extremely dynamic group, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and sort of the diversity, not just in our backgrounds, but in our expertise that we are bringing to the table. So your question is very appropriate for the discussion and sort of the topic of interest that we have these days around the focus that we have around clinical trials. So clinical trial is basically a means of bringing a drug to the market. And it goes through, what people don't realize, it goes through many, many years of research. So this is extremely important because there has been a lot of controversy on clinical trials and around the vaccines that were recently approved, but there's a huge amount of scrutiny and scientific insights and research that go into it. The typical phases of clinical trial, there are 4 phases of clinical trial. The 4th phase is after the drug is approved. The first 3 phases are what lead up to the approval of the drug for eventual use. So the first, all 3 of the phases rather, have a focus on safety. The 3rd phase of the clinical trial, the phase 3 trial, is both efficacy and safety. And mind you, in the other phases as well, we do collect preliminary data on efficacy as well. So you have a very holistic picture. And every disease has its own timelines and duration of the trial, and it hinges on the type of illness it is. So it's not one size fits all. So it's very individualized to disease areas. Like rare diseases have their own, oncology has its own approach to clinical trials, but it is a science in itself. And it's very individualized to each disease area. And what we're seeking to do, it's basically, if you really break it down, it's like an experiment that you're doing in which people are involved. They're volunteers, of course, and informed ones. They have massive informed consents that they read through. And of course, each phase changes according to the data that you get from the phase before. So there's a phase where you find the right dose, the safest dose and the most efficacious dose. And then eventually when you're at phase 3, you know which dose generally. And then in some cases you are trying out 2 doses, but that's, again, individualized. But you are now focused on efficacy. And as I said, throughout it all, you always have safety as a primary objective. One of the primary objectives. So it is a very detailed process. And what you're trying to do, and this goes to your earlier point about the need for diversity. The experiment is supposed to tell us about whether the drug works, but guess what? It is also supposed to tell us that this drug will work once it's out in the community with different people, with different backgrounds, with different identities and different histories. So there is a degree of extrapolation. So it is necessary for the scientific integrity of the trial that we include the right people in the trial, a diverse set of people who are representative of the broader population. And that is also a critical piece of the diversity discussion, that it is important it's not just something, it's not a box to check. It is actually part of our scientific interest to get a diverse population. And that is something that everybody should be aware of. And most people are now working in this direction. But part of the solution is engaging with the community. So they're part of the solution. So we have diverse people like the folks on this panel. who are involved in the research, and the outreach is also to other people as well. So that is, I hope I answered your question, but if I left anything out, just please let me know.
No, I think you answered it quite well. And I think as we've been all living through COVID, this broader issue of underrepresentation came up as an issue, both in the number of people of color who had succumbed to the virus, but also during the trial of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine. And you'll recall, and I've heard that this is quite rare, that they slowed the trial, Moderna did, in order to bring in and recruit more people of color. And so it sounds like that is something that needs to be done across the board as we take a look at clinical trials in the rare disease space as well. Dr. Syed, let me just stay with you for a moment. And what I'll do is have each of you talk to us a bit about what your job is, what your role is in the world of clinical trial research, because for all the people who may be listening today, who may have their mind set to do one thing, they may hear something about each of your individual stories that may, help them think a little bit differently about their healthcare journey. So why don't I launch with you, Dr. Syed, and just have you tell us a bit more about your job and your role in clinical trial research, and we'll go through all of our physicians here.
Sure, Leslie, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm a neurologist by profession, and I work in the clinical trial space. I'm very, like, today I'm here because I'm passionate about clinical trials and diversity in general and health equity. In my day job, my role is as a clinical lead at a pharmaceutical company, and what that means is that I design and lead mostly phase 3 trials. My area of focus has been multiple sclerosis mostly, but I have worked in other spaces as well within the neurological realm. You mentioned my affiliation with the American Muslim Health Professionals. That is a volunteer board position with a public health organization. And over there, like I do focus, that is something I do more in my free time. So I do focus on health equity related matters, and I have been involved with the RDDC from that forum as well. So yeah, so that is briefly speaking what I do.
Perfect. Dr. Felton Anderson, since we're here in the circle here, I'll come right to you next. You are a cardiologist.
Yes, I am. I've been practicing cardiology for about 25 years in the local area, but I'm also a principal investigator. I have my investigative group, Anderson Medical Research, and we have been doing clinical trials for about 1.5 years. I've completed 1 trial already. I'm currently in 2 trials ongoing. I'm about to start a 3rd and a 4th trial in the next 6 weeks going forward. So my story is that as a physician, a clinician, I see patients. I have about 3,000 patients in the area. And what that does is that I see different patients with heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, renal insufficiency, asthma, COPD. I see quite a bit. And when I get a drug that comes new and they say, Dr. Anderson, this is the new drug and this is going to help X amount of people for one certain disease, my first question is, how many African Americans were in the trial and where was it performed? The last one medication that came to me, they said, well, this trial was not done in the United States. It was done in Europe. And so this medication has been launched in Europe for so many years. And my first question to that would be, well, how many patients do I have in Europe? And I said, I would like this to help my patients here. And what can I do to further advance African Americans or minority representation in the research genre? And it took me about 6 to 7 years to actually get into the principal investigation clinical research, trying. And the first question they would ask me, I would tell the medical science liaison I'm interested in research. They would say, well, do you have any, have you ever had any experience? Have you ever done a trial before? My answer would be no. They said, oh, too bad. We would like somebody with clinical experience. So it's almost for you out there, how do you get in? How do you crack into being as a physician to start getting into clinical trials? So my approach was to be the best doctor I could be and then get notice of the other pharmaceuticals to say, Dr. Anderson sees X amount of patients. He writes 5,000 prescriptions a week. Maybe he should know he knows something more. And then the second time I asked, I hired a study investigator who had previous experience. She'd been about 10 to 15 trials. So when they came to me the second time, I said, guess what? I have somebody with experience. Give me a shot. They gave me a shot. We knocked it out of the park. They came and asked me, gee whiz, you're doing such a good job. And the one trial I'm in now, it's for cholesterol. And they said, we want more minorities. We would like more women. Actually, one trial, I have 68% of the participants are women and 100% African American. And one thing you can do to increase minority representation is have minority investigators. That's the number one thing I would say.
That's fantastic to hear. Dr. Fanny Richardson, you are based at Howard University's College of Medicine, a daughter of Howard University as well. So you have had for a very long time the foundation of thinking about health disparities, much in the way that Dr. Anderson and Dr. Syed have just talked about. But can you share a bit more about what you do in your role and why you think this clinical research conversation that we're having is so important?
Yes, thank you, Leslie. I am a true Howard Bison all the way. My introduction to clinical trial research and research in general is a little different. Currently, I am an early stage investigator, and that basically means that I'm within 10 years of obtaining my PhD, and I'm working towards conducting my own independent research. Just as Dr. Felton Anderson said, initially when starting out, you really do have to develop a track record and show that you are able to conduct studies in an ethical way. And so my participation in this clinical trial research world has really evolved. When I first started out in the field was a research coordinator. I obtained my master's in public health, and I've always known that I wanted to address some of the health disparities that I would see and observe here in the district. And I gradually just continue to attain, education to equip me with the training and the skills to do just that. As a public health professional, being able to investigate, and look at research from a population standpoint, which is a little different initially from what Felton described as a patient kind of an individual basis. And so just to make observations at the population level was very intriguing to me. And when finishing my undergraduate studies, I did complete a intramural research fellowship at NIH. It was very much based at the bench, basic science research. And I've always just enjoyed working with people. So public health was a good fit for me. And so in that capacity at Howard University, I helped to recruit participants for clinical trials as a study coordinator, and was very much involved in clinical trials that ensured that we had representation from the minority community. And at this point, I am now charged with going beyond working in a supportive capacity to investigating inquiries and areas of research that I am passionate about. So this all started, my mother passed away from colorectal cancer when I was very young, and I knew that that was an area that I wanted to work in. So at NIH, I worked with a pathologist, As my public health professional, I looked at ways of developing interventions, ways to educate the community about their various screening practices and lifestyle behavior changes that can be made. And now, in the capacity as a researcher, I am now interested in exploring a rare disease, which is familial colorectal cancer, which has a hereditary or genetic predisposition in many cases for individuals.
Well, it is clear that you are following your passion and doing that with hopes of saving other lives. And that's what all of this is about, this broader conversation about clinical trials, about bringing medicine and treatment to people that helps extend their lives and helps them to thrive. Dr. Rodriguez Chavez, your area is infectious diseases. So you've been a little busy of late.
Thank you, Leslie, for having me here, and thank you all of you colleagues in the panel. And especially, I would like to welcome and appreciate all of colleagues and all the students and all the participants who are online attending this presentation. This is all for all of you, so we really would like to answer questions from all of you, and so I'm making the pitch here on your behalf, Leslie. So the question is about rare disease, diversity, careers in clinical research. And let me tell you a little bit of me in all of this. Currently, I am a Senior Vice President for Scientific and Clinical Affairs. I am leading the strategy for the modernization of clinical trials in the second largest clinical research organization in the world, ICON PLC. And I am leading digital medicine strategy for the organization. That means all the strategy thinking and protocol design, protocol optimization, consultation with multiple industry colleagues and partners to understand the utilization of digital wearables, digital health technologies, digital endpoints, digital therapeutics, digital electronic clinical outcome assessments, and so on and so forth, and the implementation of all of these approaches into modern clinical trial designs. Before I was in this position, I came from the FDA. I was a senior officer at the FDA, in which I actually spearheaded with my supervisor and a group of colleagues decentralized clinical trials. I believe that is an excellent way of improving efficiencies in clinical investigations, and based on the evidence and the surveys and the multiple studies that are being conducted, seems to be the case in terms of the advantages. So I have been an advocate for the implementation of decentralized clinical trials and the utilization of digital health technologies, because these trials are conducted in our communities, decreasing the burden of the participants, empowering people to participate in clinical trials in the places where they live without having to travel to clinical research sites and so on and so forth. And I can speak for a long time about this, but this is not the main topic of the conversation. So prior to the FDA, I worked at the National Institutes of Health in 4 different institutes. I trained there like Feni did. I was doing basic research, I was doing translational research, and I was a co-PI, co-principal investigator in multiple clinical trials. So my career, I have been in the industry as well, and my career, really my focus, my specialty is in infectious diseases and vaccines. And so, yes, I have been really busy. I was busy when COVID-19 hit us, and I was at the FDA. And it has been continuously busy because clinical research is a never stop enterprise in the place where I work, in a clinical research organization. This is an exciting career. This is an exciting pathway. I came to the United States as a student. I came from Venezuela. I didn't speak the language. I was a student like all the others, learning the language, learning the culture, following a passion, my passion for science and medicine. And as I grew within my career, I really understood that though I was able to do basic and translational research, I was more focused on the applied research and therefore clinical research. I am extremely passionate about clinical research because you see the tangible product, which is the medical product, the new medical product that will be utilized by the people that needs it the most. I am an advocate for rare diseases, even though my specialty is in infectious diseases and vaccines. And in the realm of diversity, I would say that this, as Sana discussed, it is important to assess safety and efficacy of any new investigation or medical product in diverse populations, not only because it's ethically, medically correct, so scientifically we eliminate bias, but also it is important from the regulatory standpoint to eliminate bias and to have the true assessment of efficacy and safety of a new medical product in the current makeup of the populations of societies in the world. And that is really critical if we want to understand it. The FDA, and this is for everybody, has issued 2 guidance documents in regards to diversity and inclusion. This is longer something that is nice to have. It's a regulatory expectation and it's a requirement. One guidance was published in November of 2020. Another one was published in April of 2022. And that is just to say that there is a need for everyone who wants to develop a new drug, a new medication, to include a table for diversity enrollment plans. And that is a requirement, that is a regulatory expectation.
Got it. We'll talk a little bit more about that, Dr. Rodriguez Chavez, as we move through the conversation. But let me pull Dr. Sybil Anderson into this conversation as well. And your focus really in your role is all about recruiting young people of color to come into these spaces and to help change the landscape. So, Dr. Anderson, if you could also tell us, fairly briefly about what you do and why it is important in the role of clinical trial research, that would be great to hear as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie. And I do want to thank the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition for having this conversation. This is so vitally important. So thank you for bringing us all together. And thanks to the students and physicians who are on the call. So I am Director of Diversity in Research Programs at National Medical Fellowships, which is a nonprofit that has been around since 1946. Solely dedicated, and the only national organization solely dedicated to providing scholarships and career development programs to students primarily, and now physicians who are underrepresented in medicine. And so in our new diversity and research programs portfolio, the focus is on clinical research. We have 2 programs. One is the NMF Diversity and Clinical Trial Research Program, or NMF Doctor, that provides a certification opportunity, but more importantly, or I should say equally importantly, ongoing post-training support. And I really want to signal the importance of that, because while a certification is important in doing exactly what Dr. Felton Anderson and Dr. Finney Hunter Richardson pointed out, the need to be able to get access, certification gets you there. But we have learned and are really sort of amplifying the importance of the network, of really building a community of practice together. So that is one arm of our program, and the other is the Robert A. Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trials Award Program, which has 2 programs: a Career Development Award for early and mid-career physicians from groups underrepresented in medicine, or with a demonstrated track record of commitment to diversity in research. So that's a 2-year career development award and a pipeline program for medical students who want to explore clinical research as a career pathway. So we've been doing this for a very long time, providing the support for students who want to have access to careers in healthcare, who need that support. We have over 32,000 alumni. We've made over $40 million in scholarships in 76 years. And now we're really excited to be working in the clinical research space with all of you and creating access and being the wind behind the backs of young people and young early career and also mid-career physicians who are trying to get their foot in that door.
Thank you, Dr. Sybil Anderson. Dr. Syed, I want to come back to you because we've talked a little bit about trials, just kind of telling people this is what it's about. Dr. Felton Anderson talked about how the trials of getting into the trials. But let's talk a little bit about how these trials work. Obviously, they're designed to investigate a myriad of things from disease prevention to screening methods to diagnosis and quality of life. And so the question is, so how do we promote and create opportunities for more scientists of color to deliver this message to communities who are impacted by social determinants of health disparities, right? We hear that term quite a bit, social determinants of health, which impacts a whole lot of things. But as we talk about clinical trials, I'd love for you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, it's a very complicated topic, and we need a multimodal approach. I mean, Dr. Anderson, Felton Anderson touched on something already in that realm. They kept coming to him and saying, oh, well, you don't have experience. Sometimes expertise is independent of experience, and experience is how you gain additional expertise. So what comes first, right? So I do think that is one part of this. So there's pieces. First is the creation of the trial itself. I think we need diverse people involved in that. Like I am sitting in that kind of role right now. And granted, a clinical trial is not about, oh, we need to design a clinical trial for a person of this ethnic background. It's a clinical trial is a clinical trial is a clinical trial. However, what does vary sometimes is that you get panels of experts together. And a lot of times people will default to the people that they are familiar with. And those are, the usual suspects, which was probably one of the barriers that Dr. Anderson faced. He somehow was not part of those usual suspects back then. So that needs to breaking that mold requires someone who comes into that space and says, no, we're going to do things differently now, because I think that the landscape is changing, that the scientific integrity demands a different approach because of like the concepts that you have in your own mind. You bring that to the table. Then the outreach. And I do think that now has been a shift. Like I can't speak for every single company, but I have seen an emphasis on improving our outreach and improving the way that we engage with different hospitals and investigators and bringing in new people as well. But sometimes there is a third barrier, like there's the outreach piece, but there is a third barrier. There's the barrier of resources. There's the barrier of like the infrastructure at the hospital. That cannot always come. So that's what I mean, a multimodal approach. Maybe it's also the way that resources are allocated to different hospitals. There needs to be some rethinking there. Like, where are we investing these resources? That's what I mean. Like, everybody has a piece of the responsibility here. So, because you have to have that infrastructure, and of course, there are times where different companies will try to supplement this and bring in an outsourced model. But at the same time, Dr. Felton Anderson needs protected time for this. So we need to make sure that that is possible, that the investigators are in an environment where they're able to conduct it appropriately. And then, of course, there is still, like what Dr. Anderson said, the experience part. And it seems like he has the experience, but say, for instance, like there's someone who's new to the field, maybe from one of our attendees, and they want to have some kind of preliminary experience, creating opportunities for that. And maybe Dr. Sybil Anderson is part of that solution, where she is creating those opportunities. And so it is really a multimodal kind of issue. But I do think that there's a lot of people that come into it that have the responsibility to pay attention to it. And I think the responsibility of the attendees is that they should listen to this, think about their interests, and if it truly speaks to them, consider this path, which is a little less traveled sometimes if you're coming at least from a purely clinical background. Like, well, maybe not all of us fall into that, but like, you know, Dr. Anderson and my background is more medical, and that is not something you instantly think of when you're going through your training. Of course, there's some opportunities, but not always.
Interesting. You know, Dr. Anderson, and this is for Dr. Felton Anderson, it would seem to me that you would have been a perfect fit to be a clinical researcher because you have a built-in population that is underrepresented already, that it could be meaningful in these clinical trials. But you have gotten through that hurdle. You are in the thick of it. You are doing these clinical trials through the wing that you have. And I wonder, when you complete those trials on a rare disease outside of the journal articles that are shared within your insular population, how does that information get to the rest of us, or to the communities that are affected, or to the very people who should be in those clinical trials?
I can give you two sides to that. As an investigator, once the trial is over, there's so many other people in line that are going to promote the drug and get the drug out there to whoever the intended targeted patient is for cholesterol or diabetes. So from an investigator standpoint, once we're finished, like they said, it may take about 10 to 15 years to even develop a drug from concept to presentation to the market. But as a physician, not as an investigator, I can let the patient know how safe and effective the medication is. I can tell them that it has gone through all the trials and it has very good steps to ensure safety, and that this medication is for them. So I can sell the medication to them, telling them this is a new medication that's going to help you get to where we want to go. We, as physicians, I'm a private practice practitioner, so I'm right on the front line in the field. So as we see national guidelines, I'll say, for instance, cholesterol, the LDL, which is a bad cholesterol, we cut off at 100. But if you have had a disease or a vascular event, now the LDL level is 70 or less. And over about 75 or 80% of the population who's had this event are not at goal. So a patient comes in with a prior heart attack, and I say, Mrs. Jones, you're on the maximum cholesterol medication, and your LDL cholesterol is 85. You're not at goal. We need to get you to the next level to decrease that cholesterol burden to prevent a second heart attack. The medication is just now on the market. It's a new medication. I've gone through the trials. I've seen the journals. This is for you. I can guarantee it's going to be safe. And as a physician in the community for 25 years, I've had patients follow me for 20 years, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers, their uncles. And so with that trust and that faith and that bond that you get as a physician on the front line, recommending medications, you can actually get it to the population it's intended to. And so that's one thing. One more thing I want to say as far as infrastructure, for all you students out there and other physicians getting started, okay, I want to be an investigator. Okay, Dr. Anderson, you need a centrifuge. Okay, Dr. Anderson, you need a refrigerator that keeps the temperature at 5 degrees Celsius with an alarm on it. Okay, Dr. Anderson, you need a freezer that keeps it at negative 60 degrees. Dr. Anderson, you need a room that is double locked, cabinets that nobody has access to. Dr. Anderson, you need to make sure this, and this goes through. And as I'm sitting here trying to get all that together with limited resources, I hired my study investigator. I had her on hold for 5 years saying, just wait, but I still had to pay her enough to keep her interest so that she would still be affiliated with me. And once I did get a trial, I could hit the ground running. So infrastructure that academic institutions have, but physicians out in the field don't really have that access. And as far as studying coordinators and investigators, there's now a shortage because a lot of them are timing out, and some facilities can't even investigate because there's such a shortage. And so as we train and get people into this, we'll have more. Even this war in Russia, Ukraine, that's held up a few investigations, study trials, because some of those patients are in the trial. So now can they get to see the physician? As they're interrupting the flow, we have to see a patient every month and give them a drug, check their blood pressure, check their medications. Some patients can't get there. Transportation, I've offered transportation for my patients. You have a stroke patient that needs to come in on a clinical trial, they can't travel alone. They can't, so they have to bring them and their family member. Dr. Anderson, I can't make it. Don't worry, I'll Uber you, I'll pay for it. Just get them in. There are a lot of little subtle hiccups and hurdles that you have to be able to see and anticipate, even if you don't, just overcome it. So I tell people, as physicians, we're all scientists. We want to do scientific experiments, but it's like doing a scientific experiment on the back of a pickup truck on the freeway going 70 miles an hour. You know, it's just all things happening to you at once, and you really have to handle it. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies they can't risk money on someone who has no experience, and they can't create and recruit. And so there you might be a dead end. So we need advocates to say, hey, we can do this. We need to show that we can do it, but develop the infrastructure and the perseverance and the patient population.
Perfect. I'm going to keep us on target here because it's 1:42 and we get to have this conversation and bring in other questions up until 2:00. So I'm going to keep this moving a little bit, and I appreciate your grace on all of this to all of the doctors in the house. Dr. Richardson, picking up on what Dr. Anderson said, he was talking about being a private physician and having limited access to resources. You are part of a consortium of HBCUs that could be doing this perhaps in a way that using some collaborative effort might make it a bit easier to do these kinds of integrated and design studies that allow clinical questions to be answered. Is that something that's already in progress? Is that already happening?
Yes, that's a great question. I just wanted to start off by saying, it's important to recognize the role of HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, which were put in place so that African Americans and minorities would have institutions and be able to obtain higher education, because prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was limited capacity for Black or African enrollment. And so HBCUs are charged with making sure that they recruit and have representation of minority populations, but also you find often HBCUs are consulted because they have access to those communities. And it is important to make sure that we shield and safeguard those communities as well, because of the history of mistrust and distrust. And so being at Howard University, there's definitely a consortium. I give an example in terms of the Novavax vaccine clinical trial. They reached out to several HBCUs, Howard University included, as well as Meharry, just to name another, for our ability to work with community-based organizations, our ability to work with Pan-Hellenic Greek organizations, because you have the trust and the rapport, of the community. And so I just like to highlight, as we talk about clinical research, you have team-based science. And this effort is very important because it allows you to rely and pull together the expertise and resources of multiple collaborating institutions. One, so that you pull this expertise, but we work in a collaborative way that is representative of all the key stakeholders, multiple specialties, multiple members of the community, that the ultimate goal is to address the health disparities and improve, quality of life. I just like to highlight specifically, they have what's called clinical and translational science awards. That is some funding that is internal at Howard University. It provides the opportunity to build infrastructure, not only for investigators, but also to create a pipeline for students and postdoctoral trainees, as well as, medical trainees that are interested in clinical and translational science or research. And then we also have the research centers for minority institutions, RCMI. Both of these programs are funded by NIH. And I can say it gives you that opportunity and platform to get that initial funding to develop your pilot data. That's your initial data to support then getting more robust funding to do, further studies. So HBCUs, team-based science, support internally. And I can say that's where I started because it can be very challenging trying to obtain funding, which is very competitive. And if you have these resources internally at your institutions, it's important to take advantage of that, as well as the additional training and resources available.
Perfect. We've been talking about research. We've been talking about medications and Dr. Rodriguez Chavez, and we know that medications work different for different people. And we really need to understand these differences early, which is why the clinical trials are so important. And so I guess, how do we start to understand the gap of minorities in this space and build bridges to overcome that so that we can get more people into these clinical trials and get them aligned with these medicines that can help them sooner rather than later?
Yeah, that is a very important question, Leslie. And Dr. Said already mentioned the multimodal approach. I call it the multi-pronged approach. And in reality, there is a need of a combination of approaches to reach different communities with messages that make sense to these communities. So it's not one size fits all. There has to be community advocates that are representatives of these communities, trusted individuals among these communities that can actually deliver this kind of messaging. Right now, we're in the era of the digital media, and even the digital media has to be customized because there is a great deal of penetration. But at the same time, the digital media might also have challenges because there is the digital health divide, and some of our communities in rural areas do not have access to these digital technologies. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It has to be done on a stepwise approach. It has to be designed proactively. Dr. Felton Anderson also mentioned the need to, and Dr. Said also mentioned the need to include diversity, not only thinking on the diversity aspect from the patient perspective, but the diversity has to be embedded within the organizations. The multicultural teams, the diverse teams that participate in protocol development and in all the steps of the clinical investigation needs to be diverse. And the organizations need to develop a policy and a strategy to incentivize, motivate the participation of diversity within their organizations. That is critical. When we think about clinical research and we're developing the protocol, and at that stage is when we're trying to think about diversity, we missed out all the other aspects of the life cycle of a molecule, from the research and development, the clinical, the translational preclinical, and even the early phases of clinical investigation. So it's a multi-pronged approach that has to be taken on in consideration early on.
Dr. Sybil Anderson, we've heard a lot about why it's important to get underrepresented people of color into these clinical trials and how difficult it can be even on the research side to do this kind of thing. Your job is to help the young people, the emerging health professionals, get them the support they need so that they can stay in this for the long haul. And you talked a bit about providing support and ways for minority fellows to be successful during their training. So what are you doing to help with that process, and how can you help them today?
So thank you for that question. In our programs, really, we are aiming to cultivate a new generation of world-class, community-oriented clinical trialists. And so we have curricula that do both, right? So that really enable our participants to become the best researchers on the planet. So the clinical investigator certification course that we have as part of NMF Doctor is really focused on this highest level of good clinical practice. Similarly, with the Robert A. Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trial Program, there we have a 6-day intensive workshop on design and implementation of clinical trials that's modeled on the AACR, which is the American Association for Cancer Research, and ASCO VAIL workshop, Methods in Clinical Research. Really high level, best faculty available to deliver that 6-day intensive that's then followed by 2 years of a community-oriented clinical trialist curriculum. And so that first level of support is to provide them the intellectual resources to, in fact, be the best scientists they can be as clinical researchers. On the community engagement side, we are looking at ways to build cultural competency, but also to build partnership with community. And so we think of that as support in preparing this new generation of clinical trialists to really be successful in recruiting and partnering with the community at all stages of the clinical trial process. The other facet of this, and we think of support, we are thinking largely in terms of the support of the clinical research community. So mentoring is huge in all of these programs. And so, for example, in the 2-year Career Development Award under the WIN program, our participants, trainees, are on active clinical trials being mentored by senior investigators. So we're creating that path for Dr. Felton Anderson and Dr. Fanny Richardson early on to get that experience. So there's the support of a mentor. And then we have just a plethora of resources by way of an online learning community, virtual resource library, and then mainly just really trying to reach out and discover the Dr. Felton Andersons, the Dr. Sana Syeds, all of the researchers that are out in this landscape, to bring them together to build a very solid mentoring network for the young investigators and the medical students that are trying to get in the door.
This is fantastic information. So we've got about 6 more minutes and we've got lots of questions, and I'm going to try to get to these really quick. So we'll just have one person do it and try to get right to it. This first question is about if you want to change careers, if someone wants to pivot, should you get an internship or should you begin education immediately if you want to go into clinical research? Who wants to take that one? Is that one for you, Dr. Syed?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer because so I switched over from a more clinical role to research like relatively early in my career. I finished my fellowship and then 2 years as faculty, and then I switched over to work full-time on clinical trials and only see patients part-time. It's difficult to see where it depends on your career. So, but let me speak a little bit by example, and then you can extrapolate, and maybe others can jump in if they want. So, for me, I did put my time in. I did my residency. I did 2 fellowships. I also did a master's with the emphasis on research. So that education is important. You don't have this is a complicated scientific realm, so investing time in your education is important. Then I did, when I was faculty, I did a 2-year training program that was conducted as part of a collaboration between Pfizer and Tufts Medical Center. I will say that that really trained me to think about clinical research properly. It helped me identify, and it's not just about training, it's also about unlocking your own interests as well, I would say. It may sound fancy to say, oh, I do clinical trials, but do you understand what that entails? Do you want to do that? So I would say that I put like that is how I invested in myself. And I did go through some training steps to get to where I was. I did do it a little bit earlier, but someone who does clinical trials 5, 10 years into their career, I would say that if you have been seeing patients and doing all of the work that comes with clinical care, you are advanced already. So maybe publishing and taking a different pathway is better for you, but that is what worked for me.
Perfect. There's another question. Are there preferred specialties for physicians wanting to go into clinical research? Who wants to take that one? Is that for you, Dr. Rodriguez Chavez?
So clinical research is open for physicians and for scientists equally. And the multidisciplinary team is what makes the clinical research an enterprise that is of excellence. There is a great need of professionals in clinical research in all areas of science and medicine. There is no one specific therapeutic area that is favored in terms of the need for clinical research. There is an unmet need, there is an unmet need exactly of multiple medicines in multiple therapeutic areas in the United States and around the world. And we need people working in all therapeutic areas and professionals from all kinds to work together in these teams.
Got it. Are there big differences between clinical and translational research, and which one should one focus on? Is that for you, Dr. Finney Richardson?
Yes, I would say with clinical trial research, I feel as though it is very one way in that the focus is on recruitment and trying to deliver the best therapy or treatment. The key is early intervention and having access to these medicines and treatments at an early phase. I do feel like the difference in terms of clinical and translational research, you're involving the community and all of the stakeholders throughout the research process. And sometimes that's not always evident with clinical trials. When you involve the community from the beginning with clinical and translational research, they are weighing in from the patient perspective on topics that are most important to them. They have a voice throughout the research continuum. And they're also helping in terms of disseminating, taking the findings from the study as a gatekeeper back to their communities and making sure that their communities are aware of the research, the available research, and ensuring that everyone has access to the therapies that are available. So those are just some distinctions that I see between a clinical trial and clinical and translational research. Is taking the findings from the bench, from the bedside to the community, and there's a sense of ownership in the research and the outcomes.
Fantastic. Well, to all of you, Dr. Syed, Dr. Felton Anderson, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Rodriguez Chavez, and Dr. Sybil Anderson, we thank you for your time this afternoon, for your heart this afternoon, for your expertise this afternoon. And we hope that all of you who have participated today, if you haven't had a chance to answer your question, get your question answered, all these names here on this screen, I just bet they would all be willing to help you in some incredible ways, which is why they spent this afternoon here sharing their time, their talent, and mostly their heart with all of you. So thank you so much for your time to the panel. Thank you so much to all of you who tuned in this afternoon, and we'll continue to come back and look at this at a later time if you missed something, because there was such incredible information coming from our experts this afternoon. And we thank them, all of them, for their service in the myriad of ways that they are working to make life better and more equitable for all of us. So thank you for joining our webinar today. We hope this discussion illuminated some pathways to careers and to clinical trial information for all of you, for your family and your friends. Perhaps it's something that you want to share with others. On behalf of the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, we thank you for being part of this series. Also, please visit rarediseasediversity.org, and you can sign up to be notified about future events. And please, again, share this information with your family and your friends, and have a great day. We hope we have inspired you and empowered you.